I want you to know my daughter arrived safely in Warsaw, Poland at 7 o'clock Tuesday morning our time, 2 o'clock their time, and we were even able to Skype with her a little bit later after she got there, and she's having a great time. And I will also confess before the church, I did cry like a baby when I put her on the plane, okay? But she's having a great time and appreciate everybody's prayers and support. The second thing, and I said this in the first service, I almost feel like I kind of need to apologize to our guest Steve because he's kind of lifted us up with his inspirational music and we've really enjoyed that, and I'm scared my sermon's going to be a real downer now, okay? But it's something for the past couple of weeks I've had this strong urge to speak to. And Steve and I have talked about this, and I hope you will indulge me this morning. The death of actor-comedian Robin Williams 2 weeks ago brought to the surface the issue of suicide. And there's a lot of talk about it on television and radio. Read a lot of commentary and articles on the internet about the topic as well. The reality of suicide affects a lot more families and individuals than many of us know or really want to admit. And the sad truth is that suicide has affected my own family. One morning in September of 2003, I just barely got into the church office when the phone rang, and it was Jennifer. And she told me that she'd just found out her brother Brad, her only sibling, had shot himself. And I cautiously asked, "Is he alive?" And through her tears, she said no. Brad was 41 years old. He'd had somewhat of a hard life growing up, but was by then running a successful business of his own down in Metropolis. Had a lifelong history of abusing drugs, and he was also in a very volatile relationship with a woman, and it seems that toxic mix was what compelled him that night to take his life. And to this day, Jennifer and her family live with the pain of that loss, of his absence from their family. They still deal with the sadness and tragedy of his death and the many unanswered questions that will forever be unanswered. In July of 2009, I received a call from my Aunt Betty in Texas. It's very rare for Betty to call me because she still believes long distance is just an expense that she can't afford. It's too expensive to call somebody long distance. But she called me and said that her son, my first cousin Tony, had killed himself. And he was 44 years old. Tony also had a hard growing up. He was always the mean and ornery cousin of the family. But he'd overcome a lot of that as an adult. He'd gotten married. In fact, I officiated at his wedding. He had 2 beautiful high school-age kids and had a really good job through which he was able to provide for his children in a way that his single mother had never been able to provide for him. He excelled at his job and received a lot of awards. But Tony also had a long history of drug abuse, and in fact, when he died, his teenage son was in a juvenile detention facility, correctional facility, because of drugs. When I traveled to Texas for Tony's funeral and to visit with family, what grieved me most deeply was to learn that my cousin had for some time been expressing symptoms of deep depression. For several weeks, I was told, he kept saying to everyone, "I'm done. I'm done." He was simply tired of living. He apparently felt his life had no purpose, no passion, no meaning, and he was done. Last weekend, my mom and my sister went to visit my Aunt Betty. She's my late father's only sister. And Betty's now battling cancer and knows she'll be leaving this earth very soon. She also has macular degeneration, trouble seeing, which means she can't drive or get around on her own. And my mom asked her if there's anywhere she wanted to go while they were visiting her there in town. And she said the one place she wanted to go was the cemetery to visit Tony's grave. You see, that wound is still very raw and very fresh, and all those who knew and loved Tony grieve for him still today. Following Robin Williams' suicide, Ariana Huffington wrote an article on Huffington Post about mental illness and suicide, and she cited some very disturbing statistics. Even as many other causes of death are in decline, the rate of suicide is rising. In 2011, the last year for which we have the data, there were 39,518 suicides, making it the 10th leading cause of death. By 2009, there were more deaths by suicide than from car crashes. Since World War II, worldwide rates of suicide have gone up 60%. An estimated 1 million people attempt suicide each year, and it is especially present in our veteran population. An estimated 22 military veterans commit suicide each and every day. Huffington also notes the strong connection between suicide and mental illness. Around 90% of those who commit suicide suffer from a mental illness of some kind at the time of their death, quite often an untreated mental illness, with depression being the most common. And you know, one of the most basic definitions of depression, I think this comes from Freud, is that it is simply the absence of hope. Now, those are the facts, the very sad facts of our current reality. And while all of that is disturbing, what disturbs me just as much is the stigma that gets attached to individuals and to families around the issue of suicide. Many Christians, perhaps well-meaning in their own minds, simply declare, well, they're going to hell. You know, you kill yourself, you're going to hell. You're beyond the reach of God's grace and God's care. In fact, at pathos.com, I came across an article titled, Christians Report Robin Williams is in Hell. And it detailed a collection of awful statements that many Christians have posted in response to Williams' death. One Christian blogger, Matt Walsh, got a lot of blowback when he suggested that while depression is an illness, suicide's just a bad decision. Now, as a pastor, that kind of ignorance deeply disturbs me. In fact, it really kind of makes me angry. Because, first of all, most suicide is the result of mental illness, often complicated and undiagnosed intrapsychic pain that leads a person to such a desperate act. If it is a choice at all, it is an irrational choice. I had a psychologist friend of mine review my sermon just to make sure I was saying the appropriate things. And her response to me said, as I've said over the years to those I've been privileged to work with, the brain is an organ like any other. Sometimes disease processes go into remission, respond to treatment, are healed completely, but sometimes the disease is terminal. No character assassination or spiritual labeling for other health traumas. So why brain disorders? If somebody's heart gives out, you don't say, how dare they die of a heart attack? You know, you don't blame them when their heart fails, and yet we do when their brain fails them. Second, that kind of condemnation that you hear so much, that a victim of suicide automatically goes to hell, in no way reflects the kind of God that I've come to know in Jesus Christ. It's bad and I think arrogant theology and lacks the grace and compassion of the God I myself worship and know within my heart. This kind of came up in our UMC 101 class the other night, and I thought it might be helpful and instructive for all of us to hear the official position of the United Methodist Church on the issue of suicide. In our United Methodist Book of Discipline, we have a list of social principles that attempt to connect our theology, what we believe, with the real-life issues we face. And one of those social principles speaks of suicide. It begins appropriately with this statement: we believe that suicide is not the way a human life should end. To which I say, amen, or duh, But it continues saying this: often suicide is the result of untreated depression or untreated pain and suffering. The church has an obligation to see that all persons have access to the needed pastoral and medical care and therapy in those circumstances that lead to loss of self-worth, suicidal despair, and or the desire to seek physician-assisted suicide. Now, the most important part of this statement is this. Please listen closely. A Christian perspective on suicide begins with an affirmation of faith that nothing, including suicide, separates us from God's love, echoing, of course, the words of Romans 8. Therefore, we deplore the condemnation of people who complete suicide. And we consider unjust the stigma that so often falls on surviving family and friends. You see, the God I've come to know in Jesus Christ is a God of compassion and mercy and grace. The God who enters into our world through Jesus Christ really, truly understands all the pain and suffering that all of us experience. And that same God, rather than being distant from those who are suffering, I believe, is actually closest and most compassionate toward those who hurt desperately, whether they realize it or not. And rather than consigning my brother-in-law Brad or my cousin Tony to hell because of the way they died, I honestly believe that God embraced them in His love. And this is my opinion, but I kind of even think that maybe, just maybe, God finally even gave them the healing of heart and soul that they so desperately needed. So as United Methodists, what do we believe or say about the tragic reality of suicide? We maintain that nothing, including suicide, separates us from the love of God. Furthermore, we deplore the condemnation of people who complete suicide, and we consider unjust the stigma that so often falls on surviving family and friends. Also, as United Methodists, we commit ourselves to providing education and resources and hope for those who are at risk and for those families and individuals who've been affected by the suicide of someone they love. Finally, let me say this. There's always help and hope. Huffington notes in her article that suicide is the ultimate act of disconnection from society, from community, from friends, from family. She cites the Center for Disease Control that says one of the so-called protective factors against suicide is what is known as connectedness. So the most powerful roadblock to suicide, Huffington suggests, is to make or establish a connection with someone who is hurting, someone who is struggling with depression. You know, it's kind of like you're drowning in life, drowning in depression, and someone's caring and attention helps bring you up above the surface so that you can draw in a breath of fresh air. Let me tell you, I've been there and I know that it's true. And beyond that, there are doctors and therapists and medicines and friendships that can aid in one's rescue from the snares of depression. Again, I've been there, done that. And not only is there help, there is always hope. And this is where faith is so very important. No matter what we face, no matter what we go through, God is with us. The simple truth of Jesus coming into this world is to reveal that God is with us in all of the messiness of life, no matter even how crushing life may feel. And it is my belief that God can give you and me the strength, the courage, the power we need to avail ourselves to those resources and people who can help us rise above the dark despair of depression. If there's anyone here who's feeling that kind of despair and darkness, please talk to me. Talk to someone who cares. Know that there is hope. Know that God can give you what you need to face and overcome whatever things you may be battling within your soul. If you know someone who's experiencing a dark and despairing depression, that sense of hopelessness, make that important connection with them and let that person know how deeply you care and how much God cares. Hold on to them and don't let them go. And if you've known or lost someone to suicide, please take comfort in this God of compassion who understands us better than we understand ourselves.